Welcome and give a very warm welcome to John Stonestreet.
All right. Well, good morning. I will trust that of all the introductions I have ever had, that one will have been the most recent. So thank you for that. It's good to be with you virtually. I actually live in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which of course is the media home of the Christian world in the U.S., the glowing promised land, some people call it. But I'm actually in a hotel room in Chattanooga. So I'm privileged to be joining you guys this morning and the opportunity to speak with you a bit. What I do every day through a commentary called Breakpoint, which was something that was started by the late Chuck Colson. And now, good, I get to see a little view of the audience here, at least on my computer. It's good to see all of you. Just a quick show of hands. I don't expect it to be an overly large group, but if I say the name Chuck Colson, does that sound familiar to any of you? So about 4 of you. Chuck Colson was an incredible figure in Christian media for a while there in the really 80s and especially 90s and 2000s. But Chuck was known in the United States for having a couple lives. His first life, and I don't mean in the reincarnation sense for the record, but just the first iteration of his public life was actually a part of the White House. He was a part of the administration of President Richard Nixon. How about that name? Does that one ring a little bit of a bell? Richard Nixon? A little bit of yes, a little bit of no. There was a scandal, a small little scandal that plagued the American political system for generations that Nixon had something to do with, called Watergate. Well, Chuck Colson was a 36-year-old special counsel to President Nixon. If you have seen the film All the President's Men, if you have read any of there was a new series this past year on a television network in the States called Stars, called Gaslit, which was all about some players in the Watergate scandal. This was an event that was a crushing blow to the faith that Americans had in the political system. It's, in a sense, a crushing blow that we still haven't recovered from. Of course, we have had some. Let's just put it, we've had some continued examples of reasons we maybe should have a broken sense of trust in the state. But at any rate, it could be worse. Let's put it that way. It could be worse. That's the optimistic thing to say, I think. But Chuck was a part of that White House. He, in fact, was part of the first term of President Nixon. He helped engineer Nixon's reelection. At the time, Nixon won that election for his second term in office by the largest landslide in political history. And what happened to Chuck was really a fascinating thing, if it weren't so meaningful to all of us who share his faith. It was fascinating because here you have a 36, 37-year-old guy who had found himself in the office next to the most powerful man on the planet. What do you do when you've reached that level of success, when you have achieved that ambition at age 36? Where do you go from there? In his biography, Born Again, Chuck talks about being there at the reelection party, walking around kind of disillusioned, saying, what's going to happen next? In the States, very few administrative aides, even in the most powerful ones, and even many cabinet members do not, stay in the job for 2 terms. So Chuck went back to his legal practice. He went back to find some of his legal clients, and he was dealing with this kind of, what do I do now? What's the meaning of life? What do I have to strive for? He was a very kind of blue collar, hardworking kid from Boston, and was really in a tough spot. And he didn't know actually how tough of a spot he was as the Watergate scandal then began to grow and embroil him. What ended up happening there was he was sent to prison. But right before he was sent to prison, he went back to get one of his legal clients. Well, before he was put on trial, he went back to get one of his legal clients, a businessman named Tom Phillips. And Tom Phillips had just recently gone to a Billy Graham crusade and been converted. And that's all Tom wanted to talk about was Jesus. And so there in his home, Tom Phillips started to talk to Chuck about about faith and about meaning and about Jesus, and specifically took out a book that I do hope you have all know a little bit better than some of these names I've thrown around. The book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And there was a passage in there that Lewis writes about pride, which of course was my guess is if you're in that level of political power, that's probably one of the things you got to struggle with, and it was one for Chuck. And he said he talked about how that passage just really cut him to the heart, and at that point he cried out to the Lord and became converted there in Tom Phillips' driveway. And it started this remarkable change in Chuck's life, but a change that would take its first stop in prison, because he was sent to prison on a Watergate-related charge. He was about when he was the evening before, the night before he was about to be released from prison after several months. He was talking to a cellmate of his, and the cellmate said, "Hey, you're a big shot. You big shots always forget guys like us." And Chuck said, "No, I won't." And the guy said, "Yes, you will." And Chuck said, "No, I won't." And the guy said, "Yes, you will." And we're all pretty sure that the reason that Chuck Colson ended up leaving prison and then starting and going back to prison, having started the largest prison ministry in the world, Prison Fellowship, was because someone told him he wouldn't. But that became his calling. But something else happened as he started to build in this ministry that would share the gospel behind bars. It would minister to families, particularly children of parents who were incarcerated, through a ministry called Angel Tree. Maybe some of you have seen that and participated. That's a worldwide ministry. Just an amazing sort of work. But something was happening in the American setting, and that was the prison population was exploding. This is something that sociologists have been studying now for decades. I remember Chuck saying, when I was in prison, which would have been in the 1970s, so there were 200,000 incarcerated Americans. And today, and this would have been 2010, so 30 years later, he said there are 2.2 million. And what explained it? And what happened was, as all the sociologists and academics looked at it, they came up with explanations of race, explanations of education, explanations of poverty, all the typical social factors that assume that human beings themselves were good and were just corrupted from the outside. And he just understood that that wasn't his experience when he was talking to people behind bars. They weren't saying, it was the system's fault. They were, a lot of people blamed others, but basically realized that the problem was not out there. The problem was in the human heart. This, of course, is something that the great Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn said. So the line of good and evil is not drawn between nations and states. It's not drawn between political parties. It's not drawn between us and them. It's drawn right down the middle of the human heart. G.K. Chesterton famously responded to a British newspaper who sent out a request for various thought leaders to answer the question, "What's wrong with the world?" And Chesterton responded, "Dear sirs, in response to your question, what's wrong with the world? I am, yours truly, G.K. Chesterton." See, this is a very central Christian belief, not only that humans are made in the image and likeness of God, which gives us dignity and value, not something that's acquired or attained or by the state or determined by the state, but it's actually something that's inherent to who we are. Every race, every tribe, every tongue, every language, male, female, old and young. And but also, even though we are made in the image and likeness of God, all of us ourselves are corrupted by sin. We have a tendency to do evil. And Chuck realized that what was happening with this sudden explosion in the population, in the prison population in America, that it was a reflection of a deeper problem. It was the fruit, not the root. The root was upstream, that there was a brokenness that had happened in American society, a brokenness of moral decision-making, a brokenness of family and the institutions that Edmund Burke and others have called the mediating structures of society, those things between the state and the individual citizen that help form us. The most important one, of course, being the family. And so basically, he spent the last 20 years of his life founding, for example, the daily commentary that I now have inherited called Breakpoint, trying to look at what's happening in culture, specifically American culture, but also globally, and asking the question and trying to make sense of it. And I don't know about you, but it's harder and harder and harder to make sense of what's happening in the culture. It's harder and harder and harder to keep up with it. One of the features of a post-tech age is just how fast culture changes. There's a law called Moore's Law, which talks about computing speed. And for most of Moore's Law, it was like every 2 years, computing speed is going to double. Well, back in 2007, which just happened to be the same year the iPhone was released, Moore's Law went from 2 years to 18 months. Even that became faster. In the United States, it was 2015 where the U.S. Supreme Court passed a decision called Obergefell versus Hodges. The Obergefell decision was the decision that mandated same-sex marriage across the United States, overturning state-level ballot initiatives and laws that had already been established in 30 different states, basically mandating a new definition of marriage on the United States. At the time, we were told, how's my gay marriage going to affect you? And this is just a personal and private decision. Well, since that time, the speed at which the transgender movement has hijacked and joined and ridden the coattails of that gay rights movement has been actually absolutely stunning, whereas that's the loudest voice in the room. Back in 2020, in the early years of the pandemic, we had another chapter in our racially fraught history in the United States, with a famous incident that took place in Minneapolis with some police officers, as some of you know the story. And it was really the heyday of a movement here. It was the loudest, I guess, time in the history of an organization called BLM, Black Lives Matter. In just a few years, a year or two within the founding of that organization now had to have a different word added into the middle of it. Black trans lives matter. It's not in any other context and any other word that would have been allowed to have hijacked a particular movement on race, given especially our fraught and terrible racial history that we have in the United States. That's just one example. The hypersexualization of children, the breakdown of the family, the constant need to keep up on social media, the impossibility of that, the false information, all at the same time as we're becoming more and more unhinged from the institutions and the beliefs that kind of held us together in so many ways. We have a technological explosion with something around artificial intelligence and Chat GPT. These are just examples. I could go on and on and on and on and on about the culture and how quickly it moves. And it's just an amazing cultural moment to be alive. It would be amazing if we weren't actually dealing with things of such great gravity. In our context, I often, as I'm trying to make sense of this for our folks, I often say things like, it's one thing to live in a particular cultural moment where people in a society agree on what we're aiming at, but we disagree on how to get there. Now you're talking about at least having a common goal, at least common ends for a country, for a society, for a community, for a culture. It's a completely different thing to live in a culture like ours where we don't agree on the end. We're aiming at different ends. We're not aiming at the same ends and just dealing with different means. We have a different understanding of reality. We have a different goal that we're pursuing. We have different means and methods and different morals guiding those methods. It is a profoundly divided age in so many different ways. And that's what worldviews do. Worldviews divide. It's like having the universe, as the author Jim Sire put it, it's like having the universe next door. I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation where quickly with someone else and you realize very quickly you're not just you don't have the same vocabulary, or you might have the same vocabulary, but quickly you don't have the same dictionary. Your words and their words don't mean the same thing. When you say God and they say God, when you say truth and they say truth, when you say male and female and they say male and female, you're not talking about the same concepts at all. Now, it is a a challenging thing when our different definitions of reality strike at the very heart of meaning and purpose. And especially, and of course, I think this is the most important feature of the modern world, is our understanding of what it means to be human. If you think about all the questions that we are dealing with as a society, all the issues, so many of them are at heart, they're anthropological confusions. It's hard to come to a common definition of what it means to be human. Where do we get dignity? Where do we get rights? What makes us who we are? How are we different than the animals? What's our relationship with the rest of creation? How do you prioritize some of these things? It's an incredibly important moment with great weight that's going to have ramifications for the future in profound ways. And of course, it's nothing new. This is something that people have been talking about and predicting for years. I mentioned earlier Alexander Solzhenitsyn, his famous speech. This is graduation season in the U.S. almost. One of the most profound speeches he gave was a graduation speech at Harvard called "The World Torn Apart," and goes back to the 70s. And he's just looking ahead. Of course, he was dealing with the split between the free world and the communist world, but there's a whole lot more going on there. And I would challenge you to go read that speech. It's a profound speech because he actually pokes at the whole of, kind of those of us that quote unquote were on the right side of history, and how our understanding of freedom had become untethered and become unhinged. And we basically did not have a coherent vision of reality, and it was going to come back and have consequences. And of course, he was exactly right. I would also point you somewhere else, someone who saw where this moment, this moment was coming, and also kind of what was going to be at the heart of it. It's going to be a strange recommendation. This guy gets a bad rap, actually. It's because he said God is dead and he died of syphilis in an insane asylum. But other than that, Friedrich Nietzsche has proven to be one of the most prophetic voices of certainly the 20th century, but especially the 21st. I don't know if that name rings a bell. Nietzsche was a German atheist, lived at the end of the 1800s, the end of the 19th century. You might remember that this was a heyday of utopianism, utopian visions. At the end of the 1800s, we had just kind of come out in the Western world of the scientific revolution and the incredible advances in technology, especially medicine. That life expectancy had exploded. Our ability to hold back the forces of nature was at an unprecedented sort of thing. It was an incredible time, to the point where it gave birth to a lot of technocratic utopian visions. And what I mean by that is people who believe that through science and technology and our ability now to control the world, that we could actually secure our future, and that we would enter an unfettered time of prosperity and progress if we could just hold back the forces that were holding us down, like religion or the state. So you think about the utopian visions of Marxism, the utopian visions of Nazism, the utopian visions of other forms of fascism, the utopian visions of eugenics. All of these were basically through either economic determinism or through a forced kind of understanding of humans as animals, which of course we've been taught that by Darwin in the mid to late 1800s, that now we could actually order the world according to our desires and get exactly what we wanted out of the world. Well, Nietzsche saw things differently, because Nietzsche had understood, even though he approved, that science had replaced God. And that's what he meant when he said God is dead. He didn't mean that God lived and then he died. He meant that God was at the center of our understanding of the world and had been replaced. And in fact, there's a line in a parable of his, and this is my other assigned reading. You didn't know I was going to give you all homework from this particular presentation, but I do think it's very, very important for us to understand the moment, that we understand the voices that pointed us here. Otherwise, sorry, I get back to Nietzsche in a second, but otherwise it feels an awful lot, or it can feel an awful lot, particularly those of us that are trying to make sense of the world around us, that we're playing cultural whack-a-mole. I don't know if that's a loaded cultural reference or not. Now, I need a show of hands on that one. Does anybody know what the game whack-a-mole is? Oh, how do more of you know whack-a-mole than know President Nixon? That's an interesting dynamic. Anyway, we'll come back to that. But the game whack-a-mole is an arcade game where you have a mallet and these little moles pop up and you're supposed to smack them on the head. That's what it feels like so often, especially as I'm doing a daily commentary. It's like this issue back popped up and this issue popped up. I think when I talk to Christian parents, this is what they feel because the cultural pressures are, of course, specifically targeting their children. And they're trying to smack all these issues on the head. And it just feels so unwieldy. One of the ways to understand it and to make sense of it and to get our hands around it is to go back to some of these voices like Friedrich Nietzsche. The piece that I would encourage you to read is a piece called the Parable of the Madman. If you haven't read that in a while, go back and pick that up. The Parable of the Madman. In it, Nietzsche tells by the way, there was another parable that he wrote that talked about God is dead. And that was a parable called Thus Spake Zarathustra. And these two pieces have different purposes. Thus Spake Zarathustra is arguing for the death of God, that it's a good thing, that it's the next stage in human evolution, that now God's off our back, and what it's going to take is basically the Übermensch, the rise of the Superman, the strong leader, people who now basically assume that they need to be God and then basically order the world according to their whims. And he was endorsing that. But in the Parable of the Madman, who he was going after really were the utopianists, the elite, the people who believed that, the death of God made progress inevitable. He didn't believe that. Or maybe more accurately, he believed that progress was going to come in a much more bloody and painful way than the utopianist expected. He actually predicted that the 20th century would be the bloodiest century in human history. And of course, he got that one right, and the utopianist got it wrong. The reason he said that, and in the Parable of the Madman, it begins with a madman going into the market square in the bright morning hours and lighting a lantern. Now, of course, that is mad. That's insane. Why would you light a lantern when the sun is out? And the reason is that he believed that the rest of his Western contemporaries, intellectuals, were in the dark. And so the madman goes on this rant. Where's God? Where is God? And the others make fun of him because no one believes in God anymore. That was so 18th century. Nobody believes in God anymore. And he goes, where's God? I'll tell you, we've killed him, you and I, all of us are his murderers. And then he goes on this rant where he explains the implications of the death of God to culture, to civilization. One of the things he says, in fact, I'll highlight three things that he said. The first is, he said, how did we unchain the earth from its sun? One of the great discoveries of the scientific revolution was that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, but the earth revolves around the sun. And Nietzsche understood that God was like the sun for Western civilization. It was rotating around that. But when the God disappeared, the death of God meant now the earth had nothing to spin around. He was talking there about culture, that our understanding of education, our understanding of government and policy and law and so on. And you can even look at, the charters of so many nations that basically directly refer to God as being the source of prosperity and the source of light and the source of morals. Our understanding of science, the birth of science, all of these things were birthed around an understanding of God. Now, if God disappeared, what would happen to us if the sun disappeared, right? Bad day. If God disappears, now the earth has nothing to revolve around. That's the implications. He says, if there's no sun, doesn't that mean it's colder? Doesn't that mean it's dark and dreary? In other words, where do we find meaning? Where do we find hope, positivity? He said, how do we know what's up and down anymore? The gravitational pull of the sun orienting the earth around its axis. Of course, that was more than probably he understood, but this idea of up and down and right and left, how do we even know this anymore? And he says, aren't we going to have to become gods ourselves to simply appear worthy of the deed that we've done by killing God? But the line that haunts me, and it's a line, and I studied this years ago, and then over the last 5 years, I keep coming back to the Parable of the Madman and this prediction of really chaos, where things just don't seem to line up. Things don't seem to make sense. He says, Are we not straying now as through an infinite nothingness? Nietzsche wasn't an optimist, let's put it that way. But his point is meaning. One of the features now of the Western world, specifically the United States, and I'd love to hear if this is mirrored in your particular context. The year before the pandemic, 2019, was the third straight year in the United States context where the average life expectancy of the American male went down. 3 straight years. The last time that had happened, where there had been 3 straight years of a decline in the life expectancy of Americans, was during World War I and the Spanish flu. This was after any sort of, reckoning from the wars waged in Afghanistan and Iraq and the hot days of that. This is 17, 18, 19. This is before COVID. These aren't COVID numbers. The COVID numbers, by the way, ended up coming in as a 4th straight year, but it had less to do with COVID. Let me say it differently. It didn't just have to do with COVID. It had to do with what sociologists here are calling deaths of despair, where we have the moral chaos of the power brokers in society and education and fashion and entertainment and in media, and the crisis of who's going to tell us the truth and how do we know, and what's basic reality and how do we know, and all of these things. And we're talking about what's happening to the rest of people, a crisis of meaningless. Nietzsche says, are we not straying now as through an infinite nothing? The most fascinating thing about the parable of the madman to me is that after the madman goes on this rant, and it's an epic rant, you got to read it. I mean, it is brilliant what Nietzsche puts together in this piece. And he turns around and Nietzsche says, the madman looks back at his listeners and they stare at him with astonishment. And the madman drops the lantern and he says, I've come too early. My time is not yet. Deeds, though done, require time to be seen and heard. These deeds have been done, but they're still so distant from us. They're more distant than the most distant stars. And he talks about thunder and lightning, that it takes a while for the noise to reach our ears. And his point's very simple. This deed has been done, the death of God. These are the consequences, but we're not seeing it yet. We're not feeling it yet. Nietzsche said that back in the late 1800s. Folks, I'd like to propose to you that what makes Nietzsche such a prophet, even though he was so wrong about the death of God, what made Nietzsche such a prophet was that he predicted the chaos that would come from the death of God in our popular imaginations and our collective beliefs. And we're now feeling the things that he predicted. It has come. We live in a moment of incredible gravity, particularly for children, by the way. I know at least in certain parts of Africa, you're experiencing some of the ideas that came out of, you talk about Western colonialism. There's no greater example of Western colonialism than the bad ideas about sex that we're exporting to the rest of the world, particularly the victims of these ideas. What we say at the Colson Center, we often quote a guy named Richard Weaver, who said ideas have consequences, which of course is true, but we always add to that, bad ideas have victims. The disproportionate victims of our bad ideas about sexuality, and we just heard this just a second ago from, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the woman's name that gave the presentation about the preborn, but children, unborn children, and children that we're socially experimenting on. This is an incredible moment we live in. Those of us in Christian media have a responsibility to tell the truth. We have a responsibility to take our place in the long line of Christ followers who told the truth even at great personal cost. Christian truth-telling in the generation to come will come at great risk and great peril. The tides have moved. The culture has shifted to believe what we believe in many places, not all places yet, but an increasing number of places. It's not just to be wrong. It's not just to be unfortunate. It's not just to be silly and outdated and traditional and pious and prudish. To believe what we believe now is to be dangerous. It's to be considered evil in some quarters. There's an academic theory called critical theory. Of course, it comes in the various forms: critical race theory, critical queer theory, and these are just various iterations of critical theory. And the real idea of critical theory is that people should be divided along the lines of their groupings. And these groupings give them moral status. Either they're the good guys or they're the bad guys. It's based on not the actions of the human heart. It's based on the color of skin or the sexual orientation that one claims, or the identity that one claims. And that gives one moral status. So what this has done is actually given a new moral framework for which the world now is seeing so many issues. We're on the wrong side of history on that one, folks. If we're faithful to the gospel, if we're true to the scriptures, we're going to be on the wrong side of history. We're going to join generations of Christians and throughout history who find themselves on the wrong side of history all the time. That's the reality. So how do we make sense of it? I think we can make sense of it, the challenges, by being sober-minded, being honest. I think we can make sense of it by reading some of the great thinkers who predicted it: Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Friedrich Nietzsche, among them. From the Christian world, Chuck Colson from a generation ago, Francis Schaeffer. These are all people who looked and pointed. Abraham Kuyper, I think, was particularly helpful in helping kind of understand the clash that happens within societies. Excuse me. I think there are different names that we can point to. But I think that the thing that all Christians are called to do in every time and in every place is, and I'll put it this way, is that we need to keep the story and the moment straight. We need to keep the story and the moment straight. We live in a cultural moment, but a moment is just that. It's a moment. What we have as followers of Jesus and the gift that God has given us in Holy Scripture is the story. And I don't mean any story. Of course, the Bible has a lot of stories. Too often we take the stories of the Bible and break them up like they're, fairy tales, and we hold up this story and we try to squeeze it until we can get a moral McNugget. That's a line from Philip Yancey, to apply to our lives. What we need to do is hold the whole story together, because if you look at the scripture as it's given to us, and if we believe, by the way, that the Bible is inspired and inerrant and infallible, then we believe that it's inspired not just in what it says, but in how it says it. And it's fascinating to me that the Bible, in its 66 books, tells a common narrative, a story that starts in creation and goes to new creation, starts in the heavens and the earth and goes to the new heavens and new earth, and tells the interaction of God with the world that he created. And John 3 says he loves, ultimately in the person of Christ Jesus. And that this is not just something that we keep on the side and apply to our lives as if it's a personal, private truth for me. No. Scripture is personally applied, but Scripture is not a private book. It is a public book. It is a book of public proclamation. It tells the story of reality itself. The best way to describe the Bible is an accounting of reality. This is actually something that a missiologist, and his name's just escaping me here right now. I wasn't planning on using this reference, so forgive me. I don't have it in front of me. Leslie Newbigin. There we go. Leslie Newbigin was a missionary in India for years, and then came back to Britain and became as he put it, a missionary to the West, realizing how far that the West had gone from any Christian moorings that it once had. And what he said, he often in his books quoted a Hindu leader, and this Hindu leader would say, I don't get why you guys describe the Bible as a book of religion. It's not a book of religion. And we have lots of books of religion in Hinduism. We don't need any more, which of course is true. He says, what I see in the Bible is an account of reality, an account of creation, an account of the human person as a responsible actor in human history. There's nothing else like it in the whole religious literature of the world. It's fascinating that a Hindu scholar realized that. And when so many Christians don't, that this is a framing of reality. And this is where we have to ground our understanding of the world. Think about it this way. If you ever pull out of a great novel, whether, the Lord of the Rings novels, or Dostoevsky, or some of the great Russian novelists, and you pull just a little vignette out of the middle of it and say, I understand the brothers Karamazov because of this little story. You can't understand a story from a moment in that story. The only way to ultimately make sense of the moment is from the story. Let me say that again. We can't stand in our moment, in our cultural moment, and then try to make sense of the story of the world. God gives us a story of the world so that through it, we can make sense of the moment. I want to give you just quickly, and I only have a minute or two. I got started a little bit late, but I still have unfortunately, a hard stop at the top of the hour, and I want to be able to take maybe a question or two if you have one. I want to give you just quickly 4 truths. I'll go through them really quickly. 4 truths about our moment. They're true about our moment. They're true about the cultural moment that our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world are in, for good or for bad. They're true about the moments that the first century martyrs found themselves in. The first one is something that hopefully we all said to each other a few Sunday mornings ago, when we went to church, like believers have throughout history. On a Sunday morning. If you're Eastern Orthodox, you would say this is part of the liturgy every Sunday. I'm not, for various theological commitments, although I think they may have this one right. But at least on Easter, we look at each other and we say those words, Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. Now, normally what we mean by that is, I believe Jesus rose from the dead, so I'm a Christian. Well, I hope you believe Jesus rose from the dead, and I hope you're a Christ follower because of it. But that's not what the statement is. When the first followers are saying Christ is risen, they're saying it in the city where everyone saw him die. This was not a statement of personal conviction. This was a statement of public proclamation that Christ is risen. And I want to encourage you that the Apostle Peter, who was one of those who had to make that statement in Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified, he then unlocks the power of the resurrection in his first epistle. If you haven't read 1 Peter lately, you need to read it. Here's why. It is the book of hope. I don't know if you knew this, but Paul wrote the book of joy from a prison to Philippians. It's a weird thing that the book of joy is written from a prison. Well, the book of hope, and everywhere, all the way through it, Peter comes back to the hope that we have, the hope that we have. In other words, hope's not a feeling. It's not wishful thinking that things will change. It is in something that will not change. It's on solid ground. And the thing that grounds hope, Peter says, is the resurrection. See, for the Christian, actually for reality itself, no matter what happens in the history of the world, no matter how crazy it gets, no matter how sophisticated AI and ChatGPT and deepfake videos become, no matter how corrupt our states, respective states become, here's what we know: Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. That's the central truth of all history. If it's the central truth of all history, it's the central truth of today. This moment, all cultural moments. The second thing, the second reality that comes from this story, also comes from Peter, by the way, is that Christ is Lord. Peter makes that connection in his Pentecost sermon. God has made him both Lord and Christ. It's Jesus whom you've crucified. Now, usually when we say Christ is Lord, we mean, well, I made Jesus Lord of my life. Listen, the lordship of Christ is something that's personally believed, but it is not a privatized belief. It is a public proclamation. When the first followers of Jesus were saying Christ is Lord, they were saying Caesar's not, by the way. This is an important thing for believers in any generation, because we live in the already not yet, where Christ is risen from the dead, but in which the kingdom of God has not come in its fullness. So here we are, where there's a whole lot of people with God complexes. There's a whole lot of people who have taken Nietzsche's advice and become gods and presume to actually be Lord, to be the new definers of reality, to be the ones that are actually in charge. But see, Holy Scripture begins with the assumption that God exists and it's his world, and he's the one who created it and defined it and designed it, and he's so in charge, he just says stuff and it happens. This is who Jesus Christ is, the person, the incarnation of this creator who actually sits on the throne of heaven and earth. Here's the third one. Christ is making all things new. Now, I get that probably even in this room, at least if there were a room of Christians that big in the United States, there'd be 46 different views of the end times in that room, whether it's pre-mill or post-mill or mill. I always joke that I'm pan-mill. It's all going to pan out in the end because God's in charge. That's by the way, a terrible joke. I got it. I paid a lot of money for it. I went to seminary. You can't use that joke, by the way, unless you went to seminary. You got to pay for that one. The thing we can all agree on, because Jesus said it, John quotes it in Revelation, is that, behold, I'm making all things new. Several years ago, I wrote a book on the topic of same-sex marriage, and it was with a friend, and this was before the Obergefell decision, but it seemed imminent, and we wanted to help Christians make sense of the issue. And people often ask me, why'd you write a book like that? And I'm like, why'd I write a book on same-sex marriage? I mean, I was hoping to make friends, and didn't work, by the way. And but anyway, the interesting thing about it is I was talking to a pastor during that time who had been very active in the political side of things, and he had a big defeat the year before. And he said, John, it's over. We've lost. I know what he was talking about. He was talking from the perspective of a man in the arena. And as Teddy Roosevelt said, the man in the arena is to be respected, especially by those who aren't in the arena. But it's never true for the Christian to say it's over, we've lost. For the Christian, it's only true to say he's risen and he's coming again. See, the history of the world is secure. That's not up in the air. The final truth, and I'll close with this, the final truth is something that's very important for us to understand. I'll point you to Acts chapter 17. It's right around verse 24-ish, I think. It's when Paul's speaking to Athens, the philosophers on Mars Hill. Fascinating. There's a lot of context here that is really interesting if you study Epicureanism and Stoicism and why Paul says what he says. Among the things that he says is the key point here. Is this, that the God who made everything determines the exact times that people live in the boundaries of their dwelling place. What that means is it's no accident that we find ourselves in this time, in this place. God wanted you here. God has placed you in the time and place on purpose to be part of his kingdom and the spreading and the building of his kingdom and the gospel. So we have to take the cultural moment serious. The truths that he's risen, that he's Lord, that he's making all things new is no excuse for us to be escapist. There are escapist religions. There are religions that you can go to if the goal is to escape from the world. Buddhism is an escapist religion. Hinduism, ultimately, any vision that has a reincarnation as the vision of the end times, or meditation, as kind of a thoughtlessness to escape. All of those things are escapist. Christianity is not escapist. Christianity is centered on the incarnate Christ, the God who became flesh. And so we too have an incarnational life to live in this time, in this place. God bless you guys. It's been great to speak with you. I think we have just a few minutes if we want to have any sort of interaction.
Thank you, John. That was phenomenal. We do have you for a moment. So has anyone got a burning question? Let's do that quickly. There we go.
Hi, John. I want to know if we acknowledge that the gospel is a public reality, where do we draw the line, or how do we decide? Because on the one hand, we are compelled to proclaim it. On the other hand, we live in a worldly system where it is not encouraged, to say the least. And it's viewed very negatively when we force our views on other people, so to speak. That's what it's perceived as. Where do we draw the line in terms of that?
Yeah, the draw the line question is probably, in my mind, is maybe not the most helpful way to think about it. But I know what you're saying, and I feel that, and I know that many of you are in contexts where it's even, it's way more hostile than even here in the United States, but it's getting definitively more hostile here. I'll say a couple things. The first is that the gospel is always advanced through truth and love. what we're told is that truth and love don't fit together. That you can't actually be loving if you're actually truthful, or at least speak your truth to somebody else. But truth and love are both embodied in Christ Jesus. So if they're in conflict, it's in our mind, not in theirs. So, the teaching throughout the New Testament is, let your good works also show. So in other words, we do not have an excuse to not live godly lives just because our faith is being challenged, and it's got to go together. I think this is what made my mentor, Chuck Colson's life so compelling, because he went into the prisons and he also spoke bold truth, and he was able to do, but it's kind of, I don't know if you remember, Mother Teresa spoke at an event in the United States in front of Bill Clinton, and she said, abortion's the greatest destroyer of life in the world today. Do you remember that? It was at the National Prayer Breakfast, and Clinton was speechless until he wasn't, of course, because that was Clinton. But he stood up and he said, it's really hard to argue with such a life well lived. So we're going to have to pull these things together. The second thing, I'll give you a quote from Chuck Colson, which I think is really powerful. And I think he's quoting maybe Pope Benedict on this one, but it was that the gospel is proposed, never imposed. So what's not acceptable is to use levers of political power. Now, I'm not saying don't engage politics. Listen, politics is under the lordship of Christ as well. And there are plenty of fake lords in politics. Let's just say that. But it's like using a hammer as a screwdriver. It doesn't work. The gospel is advanced in love. The gospel is proposed. It's offered. It's not imposed. And that goes back to the New Testament, but it goes back to the very teaching of the first Christians. There's no compulsion in conversion. This was something that one of the church fathers said. I'm blanking on who it was. So that's the other thing, is we've got to continue to propose it. The third thing that I'll say is, I'll point you back to Solzhenitsyn one more time. The last piece he wrote before he was exiled from Russia was called "Live Not by Lies." I think that we don't, just because we must proclaim, doesn't mean we have to show up at every rally. We have to do every protest. It doesn't mean, Friedrich Nietzsche said that all truths are bloody truths to him. That's not a gospel position. In other words, if I believe it, I'm going to fight and die over it. There are some things worth fighting and dying over. But there are truths that are proposed, and we don't have to fight over everything. I guess we don't have to be cantankerous. Proverbs says. Solzhenitsyn did say, look, when you're in a regime like he was in, and he was writing specifically not to Christians, but just basically to people who knew the corruption of the Russian government. Here's what he said. He said, you don't have to show up for every protest. You don't have to be on every street corner. You don't have to make every issue the most important issue in the world. But don't say something that's not true. I think that there is such profound help in that piece of advice. Just don't be co-opted into a lie. Here's the thing is, culture is most powerful, not usually where it's the loudest, but where it conforms us to a new normal. And when these bad ideas about God, about truth, about morality, about male and female, about humans, about children, about sex, about marriage, about family, when these things become so embedded in a culture that everyone just assumes them, then we can quickly, through language, through pronouns, through whatever else, basically be co-opted into something that's not true. And that's where we have to take our stand. Doesn't mean we have to say everything that we're thinking all the time, right? That's not the mark of maturity. But don't say what's not true. Don't be co-opted. And I think especially for educators, for media folks, for people mentoring children, that's going to be a profound piece of advice.
Anyone last question?
One more. That's good.
One more. Have you got another one? I'll ask you one. I know you got an end coming soon. that I think will be hopefully appropriate to everybody here. So this is, I'm sure, as you know, Christian Media Association. So all of the people in the room are in Christian radio, television, print, or they're producing content for these channels. What would be your greatest encouragements based on everything you do and everything you're seeing and the shift in the culture for this group of people? What would be your greatest encouragement to us as
Yeah, you just froze, so I'm hoping you're still there. We'll see. The last time you froze, you disappeared. So we'll see if you're still there. Look, my greatest encouragement, in addition to what I've said, I mean, I really do think it's a critical moment for media, and so all of these things about, you know, remembering what is ultimately true, you know, not being coward into silence, that truth telling is going to take a lot of courage in the coming years. For some of you, it takes that obviously already in ways that I don't understand, and I fully acknowledge that. But we need to, you know, stand together on this. It's just a critically important moment, I think, that we live in. You just disappeared, so I'm thinking, Ryan, did I lose him again, you think?
It looks like it. Maybe it looks like Natalie's still on. Maybe she knows.
Yeah.
Let's see what she said.
Oh, there's a room. All right. All right. I see that somebody is back. The room is back. Sorry, computer issues, Nally says. Well, listen, I need to run to another meeting. But thank you. My greatest encouragement is, you know, again, Christ is risen, Christ is Lord, and you're doing a really important work. It's such a critical moment. I think C.S. Lewis said we need good philosophy if for no other reason than bad philosophy exists. We need good media for no other reason than bad media exists, I think, is a good way. But the thing is we not only have something to oppose, we have a brilliant message to proclaim, and be confident in that message. It is true. It is true. When the other messages from culture come at us, it's tempting, I think, for us to say, well, maybe it's me. Maybe I've missed something. Maybe I've got a blind spot. And it's amazing how many Christians I'm seeing right now rethink some of the basics of reality. You know, it's almost like, you know, we're rethinking whether the earth is round or flat or something like that. It's just an amazing thing we're in, amazing time we're in. Don't be fooled. Stand firmly on the gospel. Stand firmly on the resurrection. Stand firmly on the person of Jesus Christ. That will help you. That will keep you grounded in the moment. And God bless all of you. It's been great to be with you this morning. Thank you.